Legislation. This week, with our legislative acknowledgement, we want to continue on the constitutional right for a business to be acknowledged, right? Under the accreditation right that businesses are accredited on. And while we are under constitutional acknowledgement season, and when the Constitution opens the act that reacts in a responsibility, the legislative court of law that reacts in its responsibility. And when the legislative court of law react in all its responsibility, then the constitutional right are the right of acknowledgement. The constitutional right only becomes the right of acknowledgement when the legislative court of law reacts in its responsibility. And when we today look at the circumstances on earth, that are different circumstances for different households, for different countries. And it's today divided into third world, first world country acknowledgement. Then the legislative responsibility that acknowledges the constitutional right for countries to have a representative in a first world country. They defend the third world country. That therefore ensures that a first world country that all gets all its processes in all accuracy, in all stipulated constitutional right. The onus, Queen Winston George Philander would say, the responsibility are then therefore the legislative court of law acknowledging therefore, under the acknowledgement right therefore. The responsibility are then on the first world country. When a third world country finds itself in poverty, the responsibility for the communication that are computerized office that builds business in the first world country that locates the communication in the third world country. The responsibility under the 1+1 office acknowledgement are then for the first world country to then acknowledge the constitutional right that the third world country have a right to be represented in the first world country. And when the Constitution today makes way for so much in our day, the Constitution today makes way for a person's 100 years in a first world country. The Constitution today walks someone to their 100 years old in a first world country. And under the right of acknowledgement, under the legislative right, under the right that becomes a responsibility, under the right that becomes acknowledgement, under the right that becomes adhere to legislation, the first world country then have a right to acknowledge the acknowledgement responsibility that it has to represent a third world country. And then the court of law does not stipulate to represent a third world country that are in war, but to represent a third world country in acknowledgement to the fair processes that are also then the responsibleness that a third world country have to be responsible on. And when a process did not get to them, and they sit in a third world country, and they are legislation also, and they are not a human being but a computerized office that are built in the third world country, a hospitalized computer, a Queen Mum Universe and a George drone signal that are telephone line in the third world country. Then the responsibility for the first world country to acknowledge the communication line that are all one in all that we stand as legislative court of law. that we stand in duty on a daily basis. And the hours have become so much. There are 40-hour week from a Monday till a Friday. In a 7-day week are in accordance to the legislative right of acknowledgement. And then therefore the 4-day week acknowledgement are when a third world country are fine and treated fairly under a communication line that acknowledges the communication line. And while the communication line are greatly bold in a first world country, the acknowledgement responsibility that the first world country have to acknowledge the third world country then becomes the legislative right of the first world country to then have all its processes and to then have the legislative right of acknowledgement that are then the constitutional right. The right to be represented, the right to present yourself in the discussion, the right to adhere to legislation, the right to acknowledge legislation, the right to acknowledge the office business in all acknowledgement, the right to be responsible in all that the office business introduces in our countries. The rights for processes to be fair in acknowledgement to the principle fairness under the legislative court of law, right of responsibility. That all processes have a right to be fairly implemented. All business processes that business officers hold business on have a right to be implemented fairly. And while the Constitution today are explained in so many ways on all that we look at on earth, and while we look at different news channels today that explains it in all its different calculation, in all its different scientific journey communication, in all its different responsibility, in all that the school color introduces in its day, in its acknowledgement, in a season, in Queen Mum University and George Throne House, the home of science, scientific science, science in all God's glory, logical science, scientific logical science. King Martin Philander, science in all acknowledgement. King Richard George Philander, scientific science in all acknowledgement. King Jacques George Philander, logical scientific science in all acknowledgement. King Anton Philander, scientific logical science in all acknowledgement. And when the scientific journey have arrived so safely in South Africa and me could be born the 7th baby in the Queen Mum University and George Throne home, and while it lays on your head like a computer, and it controls you like it decides to in all that it has implemented and are implementing in its communication line, then the right for us to implement processes that are so fairly in all that we hold office on in our day, in all that we want to discuss around the communication line, there are the sensitivity in the legislative court of law. The computerized communication line, that are telephone line, there are sensitive communication. That we should decide what do we say in the communication line. How are it going to have an effect on our day? How are your day going to control your whole human body? How are you going to respond mentally, physically, emotionally, like my sister Queen Antoinette were in the gym all these years, mentally, physically, emotionally, under the computerized office, that we can say as parliamentary officers, anything in the parliamentary office. But that we have a right to acknowledge legislation and the control that the computerized office in the parliamentary house has on our human brains. When today certain people can feel the pressure of all that are legislatively have to be right in our years. And then we don't talk about the years that are then after these 100 years. We talk about all that the communication are building and acknowledging in these 100 years. All the green ticks about all that we have done on a daily schedule in these 100 years. Where should our communication in all different national countries be in these 100 years? The communication have introduced in all school color acknowledgement where should the communication be in all that it have introduced in my evoke motivational book apostrophe the introduction. And when the Constitution protects and defends a country, and when certain countries feel lost and confused in all that humanity want to do in the parliamentary office decision making in our day, in the parliamentary office decision making in our day are stipulated constitutional rights. And while stipulated constitutional rights are legislatively in acknowledgement to what then therefore has to be adhered to, then government have a responsibility to adhere to the communication that it has been introduced to, not to adhere to all that the first world countries' families have done years ago. Government have a responsibility to adhere to legislation in accordance to all that the computerized communication are acknowledging under the computerized office that are under the legislative court of law. And when the legislative court of law becomes so easy and it becomes so right that all people can do what they want to in it, then the stipulated constitutional right are the right to acknowledge all that are being implemented. The right to acknowledge all that the computerized communication are implementing under the office business. And when the computerized communication under the office business are implementing enabling bids that me, Queen Ribea Elise, were human resources, who were also health and safety director. And no one else could have been employed above me in the communication line. In acknowledgement to my Queen Mom Universe and a George throne responsibility. In acknowledgement to the responsibility that the communication line have in the international world of business, that are the office business. Then the legislative right of acknowledgement are the right for governmental leaders to acknowledge the office business or processes that have to be acknowledged under the computerized office communication line. To acknowledge all businesses that therefore, and today's discussion does not only form part of the telephone line signal, but that therefore forms part of all that was introduced to me, Queen Ribea Elise, in the journey at the Nibleybids office while I was employed at Nibleybids, when I was finished with my human resource study and when I began my first human resource employment in the office. All that the communication introduced at the Nibleybids governmental South African office where all the European directors were employed. And in accordance to the sensitivity that the communication acknowledged at in our years, the legislative responsibility becomes the responsible right for parliamentary officers to implement all that they have to in accordance to their legislative responsibility in these 100 years. The constitutional right protects, the legislative right defends. The constitutional right protects the legislative right to implement fair processes, defend countries that are oppressed when they don't have the proper computerized business office processes built in their countries. The constitutional right protects the legislative right defend. Defend. And with our constitutional right on this day, the right to acknowledge the act that are the legislative right. The legislative right to acknowledge. In all sensitivity, the legislative constitutional right the legislative constitutional right. The legislative constitutional right means parliamentary officers that implements the processes right that are defended in it. The constitutional right protects the legislative right defended. The Constitutional Protective Defense Office, that are the Human Rights Office in acknowledgement to me, Queen Ribea Elise's human resource employment. And while the constitutional rights are in all acknowledgement, in all sensitivity, in all responsibility, in all that it introduces in our journeys, the constitutional right still protects in our journeys, and the legislative right defends our 100 years, it defends country's 100 years, it defends all employees that are employed under the office businesses 100 years, then therefore under the legislative court of law, it defends all households that are built in the communication lines 100 years. Not only limited to your household only. And while the legislative court of law can then be twisted and turned in accordance to how families want to implement the womb acknowledgement discussion, the womb acknowledgement defense force in our day, there are the police that have to protect us, that when we go to the police, then the police can't tell you that this police officer belongs to that family line. The legislative right to then therefore defend. And when the legislative court of law defends us, and it equalizes to our 100 years under the 1+1 office, the constitutional right that protects us, the legislative court of law's right, human rights that defends us, and it equalizes to our 100 years. Our hashtag 100 that I worked so much with on my Instagram. And then the 100 years are a prosperous journey in all that we have to build further under the computerized communication. And when countries try to bend the computerized communication, they try to bend legislation, and they try to twist and turn it the way they want to. And then countries find themselves having to implement poverty circumstances that are unnecessary, that can cause so much aggression. And when governmental leaders have to find a way to implement poverty circumstances in households, and households are so innocent in it, and then the discussion and argument can go years after years. And therefore, under the Computerized Act, we all have a right to be responsible, to be implementing, under principle fairness, the legislative right of acknowledgement. And when you implement the legislative right of acknowledgement, then you have to learn to acknowledge and to be acknowledged in your journey, so that you don't miss out on what is only to someone called 100 years. And when as human beings we are only blessed with 100 years, then the communication builds and it builds and it rebuilds. And the same computerized communication are then again reborn in its years. And that's part of one of today's video, that we want to talk about the constitutional right that protects the stipulated right of defense, and that are also the legislative right that defends us. And while the communication line have brought us still this far, the Bible would say, not to leave us or disappoint us in all that we educate in it. In all that we have to be rightly acknowledged, in all that our educational journey have introduced in our years. And then we want to, in the second part of the video, continue on all that we have discussed under the constitutional right of acknowledgement. All that we have mentioned before, that becomes that prospers the journey that are today called the Statue of Liberty. When the journey are prosperous. When the journey provides for the journey. And while we're going to conclude today's video, and I now really can't remember the other word that I called that I want to talk about next to the constitutional right, that we were talking about last week, and we're now going to record it in the next video. Then we're going to quickly talk about the Statue of Liberty, the road that then directs us further on. And the road does not direct us, but the road that are then prosperous and that builds further on. The road that are then before us. The Statue of Liberty under the constitutional right. We're going to talk now in the next part of the video. This part of our constitutional right, the right that defends, the right that protects, the legislative right, the right that defends. With our HR2025, Business Restructuring with me, Ribea Elise. With this part of the video, I really want to focus on the statutory law, the law that stands before us in our day, the law that are introduced to us, the law that are under the constitutional law, a set law that does not change and divert off of its route. Its route is its direction where the computerized communication are building in our day. Its route are all that are being implemented. Its route are all that we are implementing further on, that we have learned on, that are all introduced on our legislative introduction. And when our legislative introduction acknowledged so clearly and so thoroughly, then the statutory law, the law that states all that introduces in its day, all that mankind built under the office business and all that the office business computerized office acknowledges in its day, under the computerized day, under the legislative day, under the constitutional day, under the human rights day, under therefore then also the human resources day, that are the office that also stands and acknowledge in defense of the legislative Defend and Protection Act. And when the Defense and Protection Act stands next to one another under the constitutional right and under the legislative court of law, then the human resources law that defends a discussion in its day. And it does not only discuss and holds meeting, and it's not only the church of meeting that the Bible have introduced to us in our years. It introduces the complete acknowledgement responsibility that businesses have to legislatively adhere to legislation. When your business legislatively adhere to legislation, then your business legislatively, human rightly react in accordance to your responsibility. And when you react accordance to your responsibility, then you human rightly react right under the computerized act that protects and defends all that it builds in its day, all that it has introduces in its day. And why do we have to defend so much? Because in this day, we can locate where all different parts of communications comes at in all different parts of the universe. And when you have to defend the computerized act, and the computerized act have to be defended under the legislative act, under the legislative court of law. Then the Computerized Act locate in all sensitivity, all that we were introduced to, that were being accessed on a computer, there are different parts of universe access, that any country can then want to punish and penalty any country on for accessing the universe, and for not being responsible when accessing, or when accessing, or when countries are then computerizedly trying to manipulate the universe under all that countries have learned under the Computerized Act. And when countries can manipulate one another under the Computerized Act, in all that they can make a way of in the universe, in all that they can manipulate in the universe computerized communication line, there are telephone line of how we human beings receive our communications on a daily basis. And when the Computerized Act under it has to be protected, and the universe have a right to be protected by a mankind that can do so much in it, and then the statutory law becomes a law that holds on to its defense and its acknowledgement and its legislative responsibility. And when me, Ribea Elise, or Queen Ribea Elise, say in my day, but Parliamentary House in New Zealand, find out why am I in the country, and do my processes in accordance to legislation, in accordance to all that you learn my processes are building in the international world, seeing that I have been employed in human resources in New Zealand. Not limited to the fact that I've been employed, also acknowledging the fact that I am in the country. And then it's legislatively New Zealand's responsibility to be responsible in all that they can do in the universe, in all that they have learned that the computerized communication can be manipulated in the universe, in all that the Chinese government are running from country to country to have to punish so that countries does not fiddle so in the universe. And so that countries' parliamentary officers learn to be responsible in the Computerized Act, in the computerized processes that are all part of the same universe that mankind forms part of. And then the statutory law, the law that are before us in our day. The law that builds all that are now being built. Me, Queen Ribea Elise, would say, after my 4-0 journey book, after our Queen was on a George Philander house, are now 50, 47, 40, 60 years. King Martin would say 60, 63 years. Baby Ewana would say 65 years. Queen Wisana George would say 80 years. King Papa Universe and Chafta George would say 90 years. Queen Grandma Martha would say 120 years, 130 years. Queen Sana George Philander's sister, my mama's sister, would say 85 years. My mama's brother would say 80 years. And while under the statutory law that are before us there onwards, there are Queen Mom Universe and a George Philander house, be a Versace hotel in all the responsibility that are being built on earth. Me, Queen Ribea Elise, in the womb acknowledgement, all that humanity are accessing and are sometimes building on earth that are having an effect in the universe. In all statutory, in all stipulated right. And when parliamentary leaders have to acknowledge in all stipulated right how they implement processes and what processes they implement, in what processes they have a responsibility to implement rightly, and then the statutory law are the law that prospers our journeys. The law that prospers us. And while the legislative court of law defends And while the constitutional law protects, then the statutory law prospers our journey, and we walk further and further. And another 100 years are reborn in the communication line. Another 100 years families are reborn in the same computerized communication line. The statutory law, the law that are before us. All that the communication are then building further on in our day that are being implemented in our 100 years. All that we are, that are our information for our 100 years in acknowledgement. The law that no one can divert off of. And in all that, the Human Rights Act releases its communication line in its day. And while the Human Rights Act releases its communication in its day, then the Bible says in Genesis 1, its day became day and its night became night. And day was called day and night was called night. And in it was light and in it was darkness, the Bible says. And in it was a right decision making, and in it, in this universe, when the processes are not implemented right, then it can divert so off in the universe while we are walking our journeys as human beings on earth. And under the statutory law, the law that stipulates, the law that states, the law that builds, that's not only called today an acknowledgement under the Office Business Communication line, this little house that me and Ribea Elise are staying in this New Zealand on this day, but the law that has built so greatly in my day that I was probably now under my acknowledgement meant to sit by a beach house. Under how I'm born in these 100 years, then I'm probably now sitting on this day looking over the beach after I've worked so hard in human resources, in offices, as waitress, as bartender all these years. After completing my primary school color, secondary school color, waitressing, bartendering, human resourcing until this day. And I only completed my office duty in the year 2022, and I'm now only relaxing in the communication. And it was hours and hours of communications, dancing communications, music communications, exercise communications I have now not done because I was only exercising in the way that I was a bartender on. And it was hours and hours of leg exercising, leg communication, and then I danced it through, and then I jazzed it through, and then I communicated through, and then it was through the human resource officers until this day that I can sit and relax. Then the legislative court of law would say I'm probably sitting and relaxing next to my beach house. My way of human resources directory have probably made way for my $1 million house in my bank account. The journey that I've walked have probably released the finances somewhere on earth, somewhere in the computerized program. And in all that I'm Queen Ribea Elise in acknowledgement, in school color acknowledgement, in Queen Wisana George Throne acknowledgement, and then my bank account are probably my ASB yellow bank card that I post on my website, probably have $1 million for my house in, that I kindly can sit and relax in after the communication and building further. And after all parliamentary officers have learned on how the communication builds. And then when your beach house becomes your beach house. While the communication has located my $1 million beach house, and while you walk the journey and it releases the money, and it's not yet only a salary, and then through my work business it's probably going to make it to its way. And I'm sitting in Auckland, SA. yet don't have a dollar in my bank account that have made, that my work business have made in its stay, and I'm sitting and relaxing under the communication that are now building greatly in New York City, $1 million listing New York, $1 million buildings. That New York City have sent to American television to show me that Frederick say he has made 330,000 commission already in one sale. Then me to the is probably getting my work business started. Now the communication and are building so greatly. The legislative court of law probably going to adhere to their responsibility. While Frederick has sent his television program numerous times through to New Zealand television to show them that he has made that commission and me Queen Ribea Elise's Journey Communications that are building. I know Queen is on a George Philander House's Journey Communications that are greatly building in New York City. And he already had an earthquake behind him. And someone is probably going to have to do right in it. And he has now sent this $1 million listing New York television programs through numerous times to New Zealand television. Saying that when me, Queen Ribea Elise, is sitting in New Zealand, someone are probably going to have to do their work in the communication. And that there's now the whole time that is here, not a dollar in. Because he shows his television program to me, showing me the circumstances that he's sitting in while the communication are building. And that he has been employed by the White House of America in the communication line. And clearly he has my name the whole time in American television. Then clearly someone are going to adhere to legislation. Then clearly someone can uphold their constitutional right, their right to defend and to protect under the communication line in the parliamentary office that they are employed in. Their right to acknowledge under the stipulated acknowledgement right. The human right of humanity to have a fair 100 years. In all that legislation that the parliamentary house of New Zealand and of South Africa and of America have to make right in meeting the best communication line that they are currently accessing. They are sensitive computerized communication line. And therefore all processes have to be implemented right and fairly in all acknowledgement. The Chinese government would say in all sensitivity most probably. All scientific journey sensitivity, in all that the communication have already built. And someone are probably going to do that. And while we are at it, thank you, Mrs. Anjanette has got a great manager, senior manager role there in her office there, and we are happy for her daughters also now working there. And then the other daughter also now waiting for a position to open in the council office in England, most probably. And the accountant daughter are now doing a final year in accountant and also going to enter the accountant communication, computerized Queen Mum Universe computerized communication that are highly sensitive, and that the children already want to have pay processes implemented when they're employed in the communication line. And whilst that they are employed in the communication line with their mother, and while the communication line acknowledges in all responsibility. And while they are now acknowledged in the communication line, that are now when you are acknowledged in being an intern in the communication line, and while you are then in your employment right acknowledged under the permanent employment right. Legislative court of law would say in Stellenbosch University, when Anjanette studied legislation, it would say in all that they are in Oxford University, Harvard University, Yale University, introducing in their 100 years in school call introduction in South Africa, then the legislative court of law in England would probably acknowledge the communication that they have been introduced to, all that the communication have journeyed in our years, all that Queen Anjanette have studied in our years, all that Queen Anjanette have been introduced to in secondary school. Queen Anjanette in secondary school, all in secondary school was the A+ student in school, and there was no one better than her. The teachers told me when I arrived at school. And she really did great in all the secondary school colors and then the university legislative colors, and then she went to go and study social work colors in the communication line, and then the communication line I then probably adhere to in all acknowledgement that the journey have introduced in its way, that are then also a computerized communication. And while the computerized communication works next to us human beings, and no one wants to feel oppressed in it, and no one wants to feel that the communication that are now so greatly built are now harming you, or people want to feel fine under it, or people want to feel right under it, then the Legislative Court of Law, the Parliamentary House of England, are probably adhering to their responsibility to implement fair processes while they are working under computerized communication. They are not only a computer, but they are my sis Queen Antoinette them in the womb, that they are human beings and they have a right to then be treated fairly in the employment right. And then therefore the Legislative Court of Law would say, then therefore all processes can then still be implemented in all countries that have processes that they have to do by my sis Queen Antoinette in the day. Let's first wait for the flight quickly. All international countries then therefore have a right to then implement processes that are then fair in all that they have, processes that Queen Antoinette are acknowledged in womb acknowledgement, in womb responsibility, in how we are wombed in our years, in how all countries are acknowledged in the communication line, and then all countries are probably adhering to principle fairness and acknowledging their responsibility, acknowledging legislation in all legislative right for legislation to be acknowledged. When legislation has been acknowledged, then legislation then acknowledges. Thank you. And then my sis Queen Antoinette them would feel safe in the communication line because legislation would acknowledge them in it. So we're probably hoping that England Council would do that part of the communication right. Under the constitutional right, under the statutory law, the law that states and stipulates that it's a right for the process to be fair, where Queen Antoinette are working at the computerized communication in the Council office in England there. Thank you. In order the communication have introduced. In order the communication are then therefore introducing. Thank you. And that's all that we want to say today under the statutory law, the law that states, that stipulates, the law that then therefore are of prosperous 100 years, 100 years, 100 years of families, 100 years of families, 100 years, the statutory law, the law that are in right of in its acknowledgement. The law that are in right of its acknowledgement. The law that are in right when it acknowledges. Thank you. The law under the 1+1 office that acknowledges, the statutory law. That's all. That's all of y'all that I want to say under my Human Rights Act today, under legislation that are HR 2025-2026 Business Restructuring with me, Ribea Elise. Let me rephrase. HR 2025-2026 Business Restructuring with me, Ribea Elise.